This is the most powerful rocket ever built. It flew 4 times. Every single time, it failed. And then the country that built it did something stranger than any of the failures. It pretended the rocket had never existed. For 20 years. You have probably never heard of it. That is not an accident. An entire generation of Soviet citizens never heard of it either, even though it was built with their money, launched from their soil, and exploded loudly enough to be seen from space. And here is the part that should stop you. Right now, on a launch pad in Texas, SpaceX is flying a rocket with 33 engines, and the whole world is watching. 50 years ago, the Soviet Union built one with 30. It was the same idea, the same gamble. One of them became the future. The other became a secret. This is the story of the N-1, the Soviet moon rocket. But it is not really a story about a machine that failed. It is a story about a system that destroyed the very people who could have made it succeed. So hold on to 3 questions. How do you erase the most powerful rocket on Earth from history, and why would you even try? Who was the man they called only the chief designer, the genius the Soviet state forbade anyone to name? And why, half a century later, are this dead rocket's engines flying for America? To answer them, we don't begin with a rocket. We begin with a prisoner. Chapter 1. The Ghost. In the summer of 1938, a man was dragged off a transport at the edge of the world. His name was Sergei Korolev. He was one of the most gifted rocket engineers in the Soviet Union, and Stalin's secret police had just sentenced him, on invented charges, to the gold mines of Kolyma, in the frozen Far East of Siberia. Kolyma was not really a prison. It was a place the Soviet state sent people to disappear. In winter, the temperature fell past -50. Prisoners dug for gold in the permafrost until their bodies gave out, and most did not last a year. Korolev nearly became one of the statistics. He developed scurvy and lost most of his teeth. His jaw was broken and never set right. He collapsed once in the snow, and the guards walked past him certain he was already dead. By every rule of that place, he should have stayed dead. What saved him was another prisoner. The legendary aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev, Korolev's old mentor, had also been swept up in the purges. But Tupolev had been pulled into something the Soviets called a sharashka, a prison design bureau. A secret laboratory staffed entirely by inmates, engineers forced to build weapons for the same state that had thrown them in a cell. Tupolev put Korolev's name on a list of men he wanted transferred, and that single sheet of paper reached across 5,000 kilometers and pulled Korolev back from the dead. Sit with what that does to a person. The country you serve arrests you on a lie. It breaks your body and nearly takes your life. And then, when it decides it finally needs your mind, it hands you a pencil and orders you to build its future, and expects gratitude. Korolev gave it the gratitude, but he never forgot. Colleagues would later describe a man of ferocious will, someone who could be warm one moment and terrifying the next, who drove his engineers without mercy because he had learned, in the worst place on Earth, exactly how little time anyone is given. And among the names he never forgot were the men whose testimony had helped put him in that camp. One of those names comes back. He was released during the war in 1944, though released is the wrong word. He was not cleared. He was not innocent in the eyes of the state. He was simply useful. And when Soviet teams swept into a defeated Germany to seize Nazi rocket technology, it was Korolev who understood, better than almost anyone alive, what those machines could become. Over the next decade, this former prisoner rose to the very top of the Soviet rocket program. But here is the detail that tells you everything about the system he served. Even as he became the most important space engineer in the world, he was still, on paper, a former enemy of the people. He was not fully legally cleared until 1957. And even then, the Kremlin made a decision that is almost impossible to imagine in the West. It declared his name a state secret, too valuable to reveal, and, they feared, too valuable to an enemy who might try to have him killed. So the man who built the Soviet space age was given no name at all. In every newspaper, every announcement, every moment of national triumph, he was referred to only as the chief designer. When the Nobel Committee asked the Soviet government who was responsible for these staggering achievements so they could award the prize, the Kremlin reportedly answered that it was the achievement of the entire Soviet people. They would not give them a name. Think about what that anonymity meant day after day. Korolev would sit in the control room for the greatest moments in his nation's history, and when they succeeded, he could not be photographed, could not be thanked, could not be known. He could not even tell strangers what he did for a living. He had been erased once already by the gulag as a prisoner. Now he was erased a second time by his own success as a secret. Two kinds of disappearance from the very same state. And still he drove himself and everyone around him at a brutal pace. Colleagues said he worked like a man racing something only he could see, as if he could feel the years Ko-Lima had stolen from him pressing down on every single day he had left. He was not a gentle man. He shouted. He demanded the impossible. But he had earned, in the worst place on Earth, a certainty that most engineers never have, that time is the one resource you can never get back. And the achievements were staggering. In October of 1957, the chief designer launched Sputnik, and a single beeping metal sphere terrified the United States into a panic that reshaped the century. In April of 1961, he sent Yuri Gagarin around the entire planet, the first human being in space. As the rocket lifted off, Gagarin called out one word: Pa-ye-ha-li. Let's go. The two greatest victories of the 20th century, won by a man the public was forbidden to know existed. An anonymous ghost, building the future for a state that had once tried to bury him in the snow. And the ghost had one last dream, the biggest one of all. He wanted to put a Soviet cosmonaut on the surface of the moon. And to do it, he would build the largest, most powerful rocket the world had ever seen. He would never get to do it in peace. Chapter 2. The Race and the Feud that Poisoned It. By the early 1960s, the moon had become the finish line of the entire Cold War. In 1961, President Kennedy committed the United States to landing a man there before the decade was out, and Apollo became the most expensive peacetime project in human history. An entire nation pointed at the sky. The Soviet Union had won every round of the space race so far. The world assumed it would win this one too. But behind the secrecy, the Soviet moon program was in trouble before it began. It started late. The formal decree committing the USSR to a crewed lunar landing didn't come until August of 1964, more than 3 years after Kennedy's speech, with a fraction of Apollo's money and a deadline that was already impossible. That was the first wound. It would not be the last. And then there was the problem no amount of money could fix. The Soviet space effort was not one program. It was a battlefield. 3 rival design bureaus, 3 proud chief designers, all fighting each other for control of the moon. In America, the whole weight of a nation pushed in one direction. In the Soviet Union, the genius was split 3 ways, and the 3 men spent as much energy fighting each other as fighting the Americans. But the deadliest fight was personal, because the one man in the entire country who could build truly enormous rocket engines, a designer named Valentin Glushko, hated Sergei Korolev. Their war looked on the surface like an argument about fuel. Glushko wanted toxic, storable propellants, simpler, but the kind of chemicals that kill the crews who handled them. Korolev refused to put cosmonauts on top of a tank of poison. But underneath the chemistry was an older wound. Remember the testimony that helped send Korolev to Kolyma in 1938? By several accounts, Glushko's name was tangled up in it, a betrayal historians still argue over to this day. The 2 most important men in the Soviet space program were chained together by the gulag, and now the moon depended on them working as partners. In 1962, a state commission was forced to choose between their approaches. It sided with Korolev. And so Glushko, the only man in the Soviet Union who could build the engines the moon rocket needed, simply refused to build them. The feud had become sabotage at the highest level of the state. Korolev was trapped. He needed monstrous thrust, and the one engine genius in the country had walked away. So he turned to a man named Nikolai Kuznetsov. Brilliant, but a designer of jet engines for aircraft, with almost no experience building rocket engines at all. And the engine Kuznetsov could deliver was, for a moon rocket, small. Remember these engines. Everyone in this story is about to write them off. Every one of them will be wrong. Because Korolev was forced to use small engines, he had to bolt 30 of them onto the base of the rocket to get enough power. 30 engines, all of which had to ignite and burn together in perfect unison every single time. To control that impossible orchestra, Soviet engineers built an automated brain called Cord, a system that would shut down any failing engine and its opposite number to keep the rocket flying straight. On paper, it was elegant. In flight, it would have a fraction of a second to make life or death decisions 30 times over. But the thing that would actually kill the N-1 had nothing to do with how many engines it had. It was something the Soviets could not afford to build. Chapter 3. The giant they were never allowed to test. To understand what the Soviets built, you have to understand its scale. The N-1 stood about 105 meters tall, nearly as tall as the American Saturn V, the rocket that actually carried men to the moon. But on the launch pad, the N-1 was the heavier machine, and at the moment of liftoff, the more powerful one. Its first stage produced more thrust than anything that had ever flown, a record it would hold for almost 50 years, until SpaceX. It rose at a place called Baikonur in the deserts of Kazakhstan, a secret cosmodrome so vast it had its own railways, its own power stations, and its own closed city. A whole hidden world built to carry the Soviet Union to the moon. The men who worked there believed it was invisible. It was not. Far overhead, American spy satellites were quietly photographing Baikonur from orbit. As early as 1963, the great new launch complex began appearing in CIA reports. The analysts gave it a code name. They called it simply Complex J. The Americans watched the towers go up. They watched the rockets roll out. They just could not see the flaw hidden inside, the flaw that would destroy the whole program. When the Americans built the Saturn V, they did something expensive and unglamorous. They built an enormous test stand, a structure strong enough to bolt the entire first stage to the ground and fire all its engines together at full power again and again. They shook it. They made it fail on the ground on purpose dozens of times, until they understood every way it could go wrong. They found their disasters where disasters are cheap. The Soviets never built that stand. Partly it was money, partly it was time, but partly it was the engines themselves. Kuznetsov's early engines could only be fired once. Light an engine, and you used it up. So the Soviets tested a few engines from each batch, threw the tested ones away, and bolted the untested ones onto the rocket, trusting that an engine was good because its cousins had worked. Which means the full cluster of 30 engines, the most complex propulsion system ever built, was never once fired together until the day they launched it. Stop and feel the weight of that. The Americans were buying down risk on the ground, one terrifying test at a time. The Soviets, out of money and out of time, were buying down risk by hoping. And in rocketry, hope does not last long. Every single launch would be the first real test the machine had ever had. And consider what was supposed to ride on top of it. The Americans went to the moon 2 men at a time in a lander built for 2, while a third waited in orbit. The Soviet plan was far more brutal. Because the N-1 could lift less than the Saturn V, the Soviet mission would send just 2 cosmonauts to lunar orbit, and only one of them would go down to the surface. Alone. He would have to spacewalk from one craft to another in open space, fly a tiny, untested lander down to the moon by himself, step out alone onto a world no human had touched, and then fly back up, with no co-pilot, no backup, and no possible rescue if anything went wrong. One man on the moon, entirely on his own. A cosmonaut had already been chosen to be that man. Hold on to him. He comes back at the end of this story, and the way his story ends will tell you everything. And before the first launch could even happen, the program lost the one man who might have carried it through anyway. Chapter 4. The Death and the Four Falls. In January of 1966, Sergei Korolev went into hospital for what was supposed to be a routine operation. He never came out. The details are grim, and they lead straight back to Kolyma. The damage the gulag had done to his body decades earlier, the broken jaw that would not open, the heart weakened by years of abuse, turned a routine surgery into a catastrophe the surgeons could not control. On the 14th of January, on the operating table, the chief designer died. He was 59 years old. And only in death was he finally allowed to have a name. The Soviet Union gave him a state funeral and placed his ashes in the Kremlin wall. The whole country suddenly learned who the chief designer had been. The ghost was allowed to become a person, now that he could no longer be harmed by it, and could no longer save the program that needed him. His deputy, Vasily Mishin, took over. A capable engineer, but not Korolev. He did not have Korolev's authority or his gift for walking into a minister's office and bending the entire Soviet machine to his will. And remember the conditions Mishin worked under. None of this was public. No broadcasts, no countdowns on television, no crowds. Every launch was a state secret, watched by a handful of officials who needed a success they could quietly report to the Kremlin, and who had run out of patience. Then he had to light the fuse and watch. The first N1 launched on the 21st of February 1969. In the bunker, men who had given a decade of their lives to this machine watched it leave the pad. For about a minute it climbed, and for a moment it must have looked like triumph. Then a fire tore through the engine compartment, cord began shutting engines down, and at around 68 seconds, the rocket was gone. They told themselves it was one fault, one fixable fault. They were wrong. But this is the thing about that bunker. These were not careless people. They were some of the best engineers the world has ever produced, working with brilliance and courage on the wrong side of an impossible situation. After every failure, they tore the data apart, found the cause, fixed it, and then ran headlong into the next failure they had no way to have seen coming, because they were still testing the whole machine for the very first time, in the sky, with the world's most expensive rocket. The second launch is the one history remembers, the 3rd of July, 1969. Seconds after liftoff, debris was drawn into an engine, a fuel pump tore itself apart, and cord, overwhelmed, shut down almost every engine at once. The fully fueled rocket, 2,500 tons, rose only about 200 meters into the night, hung there for an instant, and fell straight back down onto its own launch pad. The explosion was one of the largest in the history of spaceflight. It flattened the launch complex and threw wreckage for kilometers. You will hear it called the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history. It was not. Most of the fuel never actually detonated, and far larger accidents have happened. But as a rocket disaster, it was almost beyond belief. A moon rocket vaporizing its own launch site. And it happened just over 2 weeks before Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. The race was already over. The Soviets just couldn't admit it. It took nearly 2 years to rebuild the pad, and they tried again. June 1971, the third N1 lifted off, and almost at once began to roll, twisting around its own axis, faster and faster, until the control system simply ran out of authority and the rocket tore itself apart. 50 seconds. The men in the bunker had barely begun to breathe. And then, in November of 1972, the fourth and final N1. This one flew beautifully, higher and longer than any before it, almost to the moment the first stage was to shut down and separate. 107 seconds. And then a violent shockwave surged through the fuel lines like a hammer blow inside the rocket and tore it open. 107 seconds. They were so close. 4 launches, 4 failures. Not one N1 ever finished firing its first stage. But every failure had taught them something real. The 5th and 6th rockets were already being built with far better engines, and the worst problems had been solved. The program was at last, painfully, learning to fly. Which is exactly when the man who had sworn to bury this rocket was handed the keys to it. Chapter 5. The Erasure. By 1974, everything had changed. America had already won. The flags were on the moon. To the Soviet leadership, a moon rocket that had exploded 4 times no longer looked like a national dream. It looked like a national humiliation that was costing a fortune. And then the system delivered its final perfect cruelty. In May of 1974, MEE Shin was removed, and the man brought in to take command of the entire bureau was Valentin Glushko. The same Glushko whose refusal to build engines had forced the 30-engine design. The same Glushko whose feud with Korolev reached all the way back to the gulag. The rival now held absolute power over his dead opponent's life's work, and one of his first acts was to cancel the N1 completely. But he did not stop at cancellation. The Soviet Union didn't just kill the rocket, it tried to make it disappear. The 2 nearly finished rockets were broken up for scrap. The launch towers were torn down, and the enormous fuel tanks, pieces of the most powerful rocket on Earth, were hauled across the steppe and turned into storage sheds and shelters looming over the desert, known to the locals only as strange giant huts, their true origin a secret. And officially, the rocket had never existed. For 20 years, the Soviet line was that there had never been a crewed moon program at all. The whole thing, they said, was a Western fantasy. More than 10 billion rubles, the most expensive failure in the history of the Soviet space program, was simply deleted from the record of the nation. And the silence had a human face. Remember the cosmonaut chosen to land on the moon alone? His name was Alexei Leonov, the first human being ever to walk in space. He trained for that lonely landing for years. He came within a few working rockets of standing where Neil Armstrong stood. And then he was ordered to carry the greatest near miss of his life as a state secret, to live for 2 decades as though the mission he had given his heart to had never been real. And here is the detail that makes the secrecy almost absurd. The one audience the secret was actually kept from was the Soviet people themselves. Because the Americans had known the whole time. Their spy satellites had photographed every launch, every explosion, every rebuilt pad. The CIA had thick files on Complex J. The nation that paid for the rocket was the only nation not allowed to know it was real. It was not until the late 1980s, under Glasnost, as the Soviet Union itself began to crack apart, that the truth was finally allowed out. The photographs were published, the cosmonauts could finally speak, and the world learned that the USSR had built the most powerful rocket of its age, flown it 4 times, and buried it so completely that its own people never knew. The rocket was gone, but the engines were about to begin the strangest journey of all. Chapter 6. The engines that refused to die. When Glushko ordered the N1 destroyed, that order included the engines. Every last one of Kuznetsov's small, troublesome engines, the engines the whole feud had been fought over, were to be scrapped and forgotten. But someone disobeyed. Quietly, against a direct order from the most powerful man in Soviet rocketry, Kuznetsov's people crated the engines up and hid them. Reportedly around 60 of them, sealed in a warehouse near the city of Samara. And there they sat, in the dark, for more than 20 years, a secret hoard of engines for a rocket that officially had never existed, built to win a race that had already been lost. Because here is the twist no one in 1974 could have predicted. Kuznetsov's engines were not failures. They were some of the finest rocket engines anyone, anywhere, has ever built. The refined version, the NK-33, did something American engineers had spent years insisting was impossible. It ran searing, oxygen-rich gas through its turbines in a way the West believed would simply melt any engine that tried it. The Soviets had not only tried it, they had quietly perfected it, and then locked the result in a warehouse and walked away. For 2 decades, American rocket engineers had carried an article of faith that a large, oxygen-rich engine was simply impossible, that the searing gas would burn through any metal you tried to make it from. They had stopped trying. What they did not know was that, in a sealed warehouse in a closed Soviet city, dozens of engines were sitting in their crates that had already done the impossible, and then been ordered destroyed. So in the mid-1990s, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, American engineers were finally allowed to examine one. By every account, they were astonished. They put one on a test stand, expecting it to fail the way their own theory said it must. It did not fail. It ran beautifully. A 30-year-old engine built by a dead empire, outperforming what American industry believed could even be built. An American company bought them, roughly 3 dozen of these secret Soviet moon engines, for around $1 million each. Engines built to beat America to the moon, hidden from a dead empire for a generation, now crated up and shipped to California. They were refurbished, fitted with American electronics, and given a new name. And in 2013, an engine designed by Korolev's bureau more than 40 years earlier, for a rocket that had exploded 4 times and been erased from history, roared to life on an American rocket and carried cargo toward the International Space Station. It was not a flawless resurrection. One of those rockets was lost in 2014, and the aging engines were part of the investigation, though even then, experts disagreed about exactly what went wrong. But look at the whole arc. An engine drawn up by an imprisoned genius for a doomed rocket, by a system that tried to delete it from history, ended its working life lifting supplies for the very nation it was built to defeat. Which brings us back to that launch pad in Texas, and the question the whole internet keeps asking. Is SpaceX repeating the N1 disaster? And now you can answer it. The N1 did not fail because it had too many engines. It failed because the people who built it were never allowed to test them, never given the stand, the time, or the freedom to fail on the ground and learn. SpaceX fires all 33 of its engines together before it flies, blows up prototype after prototype on purpose, and tries again the next month. That is the one thing the Soviet system could never permit, the freedom to fail in the open. So no, Starship is not repeating the N1's mistake. If anything, it is finally proving the N1 was never a mistake at all. Which leaves only the man. Sergei Korolev, the prisoner, the ghost, the chief designer with no name, died believing he had lost the moon. He was wrong about that. He hadn't lost it to America or to physics or to 30 engines. He lost it to the one enemy he could never out-engineer, the country that built him, broke him, and used him. He never knew that his engines would still be flying in the 21st century. He never knew his name would outlive the empire that hid it. And he never got to hear the thing this whole story comes down to. The rocket was never the problem. The system was. This has been Iron Curtain Industries. If you want more stories of the machines the Soviet Union built and buried, subscribe, and we will see you next time.